Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to my locals to get updates and to support the channel. For those that already support, thank you for your support. You help keep the channel going. So this is my fifth discussion with Logos on questions about Christianity and philosophy and all issues tangential to the Christian faith. And we're going to pick up where we left off in our last discussion, which was beginning to dovetail into the question of identity. Now, a good place to start for the philosophical problem of identity is the ship of Theseus, which is the idea that if we have Theseus's ship and then we replace one plank with another plank until we get to the point where we replaced all the planks with other planks, is that ship still Theseus's ship? If so, why? And if not so, why? And furthermore, how many planks have to be replaced before the ship of Theseus ceases being Theseus' ship, if in fact it does not? Now, one way to answer that question would be to say, well, it is still the same ship, which would then appeal to a higher formalism, which seems to be unsatisfying, at least insofar as that all of the constituent material parts, to quote Aristotle, all the material causes are different. It's a whole different set of material causes. So it's difficult to see how that could be the same thing. And then if you say it's not, even though it shares in the formalism, then we have the problem, well, it shares the same formal cause, but it's not the same ship. So as we get into this, and I'll explain a little bit later, I think a true identity has to take into account formal causes and material causes, and something is identical to itself if and only if, at a certain point, both of those can be maintained. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So yeah, Logos, why don't we run with this?
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, it's been a little while. The last time we were talking about creation ex nihilo and interesting paradoxes that kind of come up in thinking about causal powers. And one of the tangents we were getting into near the end was individuals and questions about like what the will is constituted of in an ontological sense. Now, I think one of the things we ended up kind of concluding in the last discussion was maybe there were two substances. So the substance of will isn't something that God makes up in people, but a substance that kind of moves in people, that he kind of puts into the world and allows to be kind of like a base foundational thing for people doing and being what they are. So that way they have full culpability for their actions and so on. So with that out of the way, a large chunk of the questions I had about identity over time are answered. But we still have some interesting questions to ask about identity over time. So one of the interesting questions is something like, well, I guess we'll just talk about free will. And we're not going to talk about free will and the usual atheist things like, well, if God knows the future, can people act freely and stuff like that? I'm interested in more of the really, really tough free will questions. Like, okay, let's put it this way. When people talk about like, do you have free will? The emphasis seems to be on free, right? You can always put emphasis on different words in your questions. Do you have free will? And they mean free in the sense that you can like, you could have always acted otherwise in some capacity. Now, in some sense, we know that's kind of silly, right? I think in one of our previous talks, we mentioned the feminist, right? If a feminist just came up to you and demanded her money in 10,000 of 10,000 possible worlds, you're not going to give that feminist money, right? So somebody that wanted to deny free will would go, aha, I knew it. Todd is determined to act. He's determined to never give the feminist money or something. Now, but it's got to be a little more, there's got to be more to it than that. And so the way I've always came at the discussion of free will is I put the emphasis on you. Do you have free will? And there seems to be a paradox to me between your identity over time and how you, the person, would act versus this idea that all your decisions are in some sense arbitrary and could have been different. And the way I think about it is like, so a joke I like to make to my friends because I love really, really spicy food goes something like this. Let's suppose that I come to a restaurant, right, a Thai restaurant or something, and I order some really spicy food. Well, people know, of course, Logos orders spicy food. It's what he does. But let's suppose I come in and order like something on a 2 out of 10 or something. Any of my friends should know, okay, something's going on here. This isn't something Logos would ordinarily do. Is this a cry for help? Is Logos possessed by aliens? Something's going on. Now, if you get too radical with the idea of libertarian free will or some of these accounts of free will, the idea is, well, I freely do X if I'm the source of the action, right? But if all they know is me making an order that I wouldn't have ordinarily made, they can't really question it insofar as like I am the source of the decision in either case. And so if I was being like held hostage and it was a subtle cry for help, they wouldn't know. If I was possessed by an alien parasite that didn't like spicy food, they wouldn't know. And so I don't put emphasis on the free will discussion in terms of um like could I do otherwise at every other moment in time. What I'm worried about in the free will discussion is what is the you that has free will? What is the identity over time that supposedly acts freely? And if any free will account seems to undermine that, we seem to run into a problem where you cannot say you have free will unless you don't exist. I think that might be a good starting point for that.
Right. And to get this clear, this was something we had talked about privately before. The idea, your objection to libertarian free will was, if and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that if it's the case that I can choose to do, it's equally probable that I could choose any sort of given choice, A or B, if we just turn the clock back and run that event over and over and over again, then what is there about me that actually exists over time and just doesn't get erased by probabilistic decisions? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's not like my objection to libertarian free will per se. It's my objection to some of the accounts of libertarian free will that are maintained by certain types of people that I think isn't fair. I think that idea of libertarian free will is such a high standard that you can't hold it unless you deny identity over time. And so who could hold it? And so it's almost like because that what I object to is that dichotomy where you have this really high standard of free will or you have determinism. But the standard is so high that to hold it contradicts identity over time, so you can't if you think you exist over time. So therefore, the default other seems to be determinism. And I think there's like a gray area in between the two that should be explored.
Right. So, out of the gate, what I'll say is what I want to preserve, the distinctions, and I think what most Christians want to preserve, is the sense that humans are rational agents that make choices such that when they're judged for those choices, that's a meaningful thing to discuss, right? If say, a robot malfunctions, there's no choice involved. There's no action involved. Punishing the robot doesn't make sense. If you have some sort of automatons like a golem that does something at the behest of the wizard, it doesn't mean anything because so punishing somebody that can't make a choice is oxymoronic. It's pointless. So whether it's God punishing humans for our sins or whether it's the state or society punishing people for their transgressions, there's an assumption that these choices are in some sense meaningful, even if constrained, and that they have to be in some sense responsible. Otherwise, all of this just stops making sense. So I think the first thing I want to say is we can talk about two kinds of constraints. There's like what we call a constraint of necessity. So the fact is, humans are made of flesh and bones. So there's certain things that we can't do. We can't walk through a wall. We can't fly, not by our own power. We're not like a bird. So our physical anatomy puts constraints on us. We can't breathe underwater without assistance. So then there are constraints of choice. So if one, as I'm always fond of bringing up the Ghost of Christmas Future and the Christmas Carol, if a course of action is persisted in long enough by an individual, then a given outcome becomes determined. And of course, the question is, how far down the road do you have to go before that to happen? And I think that's just going to be a sui generis event, dependent upon a variety of factors, including the individual themselves. So if we were to say somebody makes a decision, let's go back to the example you had of me, where I got to the point at some point in my teenage or early 20s years where I wouldn't ever consider giving a feminist money. The question then is, was that the result of necessity or choices that I made earlier on before I had solidified? So we talk about the development of a child into an adult. And so if that's the case, then that is a constraint that I ultimately imposed on myself at a point in time earlier where I made a choice. Now, you could then argue that that choice was in some sense constrained by other factors. Yeah, it probably was, but it's still a choice that I made. So I think, but we could also be constrained by the choices of others. So in the sense that, you imagine a child growing up and, the dad is an alcoholic and wastes money, and then you grow up in poverty and abuse. Well, that puts constraints on you. Not that you consented to them, and you can't, if you were to turn back the clock and live another life with a sober, non-abusive father, you'd have a very different life outcome. And so if you have a choice imposed by necessity, or a constraint imposed by necessity, or a constraint imposed by some third party, i.e. an externality, those would be not free choices. But I think that if there's the kind of constraint you mentioned, Logos, a constraint that you imposed on yourself, that's still a free choice because it's downstream of a choice that you made, not a choice that somebody else made, or a choice that you couldn't have made in principle.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think where it gets really, really interesting is so this is something I remember bringing up to you in private. I also remember pieces of this conversation. We might have had another stream as well, but this is something that's really sticking out to me. There's this interesting paradox where um, children have the most ability to change course, and because they're the most plastic in terms of what they know, in terms of the habits they've developed, and so on. And yet they're kind of like assumed to be the most innocent and the least morally culpable, even though they're like the ones who have the most leeway to alter course in a moral decision. That's just always something I found interesting. And as a lead up, um, what I'm also interested too is the idea of like ontology over time. So to get back to the ship of Theseus idea of this, um, it does seem to be there does seem to be a sense in which we do change over time, and we're not quite the same person. And I think one of the ways I you could measure that is in terms of our moral plasticity. The idea that there are certain moral choices we could ponder making when we're younger that we wouldn't ponder making when we're older. And um, why that would be different is let's consider a thought experiment, because I love making thought experiments. Let's suppose some mad scientist stole some of your DNA and was advertising that he made like a perfect clone of Todd Lewis down to the wire, down to like every act of free will. He just like just owned it. Now you go to that clone and you're walking around with them and talking with them, trying to figure out like, hey, how much does this clone represent me? And let's suppose you have the radical feminist trying to, extract money from you for a charity situation, right? And you're just like, no, go away. But your clone actually like gives it a whole bunch of thought. The fact that your clone might, in some sense know what you know or think what you think, but he would like really consider this choice. Maybe he even does it, but maybe just the fact that he would like really consider it. I think that you would take that example just enough to say this clone is definitely a different entity from me. Like, I mean, obviously there are differences in terms of you're occupying different spaces at the same time. There's Leibniz's law of identity concerns. Like, put that off to the side. Like, if this clone were to replace you, let's say there's an actual switcheroo that happened here, you would say there's not a good faith switch happening, in the sense that this clone would like deeply consider things that you would find like absolutely like unconsiderable. And that's kind of the idea I'm trying to get at with this idea that over time we seem to become different people in terms of our moral plasticity. What do you think about that?
Right. So let's deal with these in order. So if we look at the child, yes, they have more potential choices to make, and it's easier for them to, in principle, easier for them to change course. And then you're saying, but then they're considered to be less culpable and more innocent. And I think that is, we're looking at this at the level of like one dimension. The dimension that makes them different from an adult is knowledge. So the adult knows more. And so in say the court of law, whether it's a human court or God's court, the idea is that you're judged on what you know, right? So we have the Kantian dictum, ought implies can. James says without knowledge, without the law, there is no knowledge of sin. So it's very important that you know a thing is wrong, or you can make reasoned choices. So while yes, in principle, children can make more choices than adults, at least in potentia, these are not morally meaningful choices in the same way that an adult would make a morally meaningful choice. Now, as to your ship of Theseus, when we talk about change over time, and yeah, we just mentioned getting older, so that you're not the same as you were before. Not even just like mentally or morally or psychologically, but even physically, because I think it's like every 7 years, all the cells in your body are changed. I think what I would want to say with this is a couple things. One, I want to say that the identity is maintained with a certain consistency of material and formal causes. So we can envision a human being having every cell in his body being replaced by synthetic plastics. Like whether it's a synthetic leg or a synthetic heart. But we all know at some point, if you just replaced everything, you'd kill the person. You wouldn't get a cyborg or an android. You just kill the person. And so, at what point do you tip over and kill the person in this process of replacement? Because you can lose legs and arms and fingers and eyes, but still be you and still not be dead. I think that's going to be different depending on each person, how much you can actually replace and how much you can't. And so, some identity over time would be some roughly we know there's a logical stopping point, but I don't know if it's easy to define the practical stopping point, whereby there has to be a certain unity of material and formal causes in a given thing, and if that whatever that in principle preservation is, that's where identity is preserved. As to the clone, I think what you're getting at, Logos, is the question of qualia, because if the clone has a different qualia than I do, then it is different than me, in the sense that the clone might choose to do something that I wouldn't otherwise choose to do, and is therefore different. Um, I think that it would be impossible to have anybody identical to me, because the one property we wouldn't share, if everything else were shared, is occupying the same space at time t. And occupying space is a property. So me and any clone would still be different, because we fail to have all of the same properties p at the same time t.
Right, definitely. Yeah, that's why I said like those Leibnizian concerns about properties and spaces notwithstanding. What I'm really getting at here is something I've been really contemplating actually ever since we talked about this, I think privately weeks ago. Um, I was actually talking to Josh Rasmussen about this on Twitter. Okay, so let me see if I can word this because it's kind of complicated. So the point of the clone was not to show that like you would be different from a clone, but what I'm actually trying to do with that thought experiment is to show that like there's some sense in which the older Todd is ontologically different from the younger Todd, right? Ignoring, you know, discussions about space and time and properties and so on aside, if like younger Todd in like his teens, who may not have known stuff or might have had some knowledge but was more, you know, amiable to changing his mind or something else, might consider doing things that older Todd might not consider doing. It seems to me that if we had a clone of Todd that we were comparing side by side, we'd see the clone considering doing things that you'd never do enough to be different. And so if you have like younger Todd, just like in a different moment in the past rather than a clone, you can kind of work that reason backwards and say that in some sense, like the younger you and the older you are like, they seem to me to be kind of different persons.
Right. So I think the way I want to answer that is identity between a self over time is if and only if you are identical to the mapping of all prior experiences you've had. So, right, because me in the present now is identical to myself, because myself is that thing which has the imprints of all my experiences over time.
Okay. Um, yeah, That's basically how I solved the problem originally, talking to Rasmussen as well. Thinking about this further though, I just have some like really interesting questions. Not like to you or Christianity, just like I'm just thinking about things in my head. Um, so like, let's suppose that somebody. This is gonna be kind of like one of the thought experiments I've brought up to you before. So I brought up those like 3 thought experiments that you really liked. Um, and this is kind of like it, but not quite. So instead of the car accident one, let's change it to something like, let's suppose somebody like converts to Christianity when they're younger, and then they have some experiences in life that like really beat them down or something, and they go to like some existential depression, and um, they they get older, they get more cynical, and eventually they say deconvert. They're just like, the way I see the world, all the stuff that's happened to me, I just can't reconcile it with the way God is, or something like imagine Job, who actually snapped at the end of the story or something. Um, Now it seems to me that uh, when we're talking about whether that person is, let's say, saved or not, it seems like we want to talk about the child version of the person, the young version of the person that might have been a Christian, like a young adult, the older version. So all these different versions of this person, like over time, are going to like end up in the same place, like in the afterlife. It seems really interesting to me that, like, I don't know, let's suppose the guy like died in his 20s before he had all these different experiences. Um, he might have died a devout Christian and been saved or something. And so it seems like, on the one sense, you want to say like all these versions of a person line up over time by the time you get to like the end of it. But on the other side of it, I want to say that, like, had the person in the 20s like died and been the end of it, like, okay, to put it crudely, like the salvation outcome would have been different. And so like whether a person gets saved or not seems to me to reveal like a core difference in the person. Like, if person A goes to heaven and person B goes to hell or something, um, I'd want to say that that would be some difference between the two people, and like how God judged them, or so on. Like there's some ontological like way in which they're different in virtue of like their different salvation paths. But in this case, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so yeah, just to kind of like loop it back real quick. So like in this case, like the person dying and potentially being saved in their 20s versus the one being saved at the end of their life, if salvation kind of like reveals differences in a person as to whether or not they end up saved or not, it seems to me that the early adult person and the cynical like older person like are kind of two different people.
Right. Well, not an answer that I would use, but the Calvinist answer is there are no choices. There is no variation or difference. It just is what it is because it's decreed from God's eternal will. But so that's, I guess, one way to just bulldoze the problem. But what I would say is the person is still the same, but the outcome is different. I think if we read like in Hebrews, there's the expectation that you can lose your faith. And so the idea is it there is a difference, but it's not a difference in identity. I think where I'd want to place the difference is a difference in choices and outcomes. So you could still be, quote, the same person, but you make a different choice, which leads to a different outcome. And so it's not like we have two different people. I mean, we might euphemistically say that my old self died, and that might mean in a euphemistic sense that you've turned your back on certain things that you used to do, but you are still you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I guess that's definitely like going to be the Christian doctrine on this one, right? Because um I don't know. My mode of thinking about this seems like a weird inversion of like the atheist question, right? Because the atheist question is always something like, well, if God knows the future, then like how do you have free will? Because like he knows what you're gonna do. But what I'm doing is I'm actually like flipping it back and saying like, if what happens to the past you is different from the future you, how are they the same person? And what you might say is like, well, choices made by past you builds future you. And it's like, yeah, I guess I see that. But on the other side of it, I'm still kind of, I don't know. I'm still kind
Well,
of
let me
conflicted.
jump in
Yeah.
here real quick, okay? So there's a couple ways we could look at the nature of this problem, the landscape of this problem. Okay, obviously you and I are different people because, especially if we use Leibniz law of identity, I mean we occupy different places in space, for example. Um, Now, then you're saying, okay, so there's that obvious difference. I'm different than you, and you're different than me. But then you're saying that, okay, well, there are differences, roads not traveled that I could have taken but didn't, that you could have taken but didn't. And in that sense, that wasn't developed, that wasn't realized, that wasn't reified. But then the problem is those selves that were never made manifest. Are they different in a sufficient way to the extent that you and I are different, that they constitute different persons?
Yeah. Even more than that, though, I'm not necessarily talking about somebody that like traveled different roads. So the example I'm thinking of is like one singular linear past lifetime with like a past, present, and future. And at some portion of somebody's life, they were in fact not like some other possible world, but from time A to B, they were a devout Christian. They had this view of God and the world, and everything was loving and so on. But then sometime after time B, a whole bunch of terrible things started happening to him or whatever until he reached time C. And then from time C to D when they died. So between B and C, crazy stuff happened. Between C and D when they died, they were like a cynical non-Christian. They thought God had abandoned them or there was no God or something. And like they died out that way. So this isn't like counterfactual possible worlds. But what I'm saying is, I think a Christian would agree that somebody who is like a devout Christian in a relationship with God that has a certain view of the world, they'd be very much a different person than they would be otherwise if they were like, I don't know, a cynical atheist or something. Like the Todd that's a Christian would be very much different than the Todd who's an atheist if the two were ever to meet each other, right? So it is weird because this part would get into possible worlds talk because like you are a Christian, like you never say abandon your faith or whatnot, right? But if you did abandon your faith, imagine like the you that abandoned your faith in the future meets with the you that has the faith in the past. They'd certainly have different opinions, different ideas about things. They'd interact as different people rather than like being like synchronous in thoughts and ideas and so on. And it's this tension that I'm really thinking about.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that would be me because again the way I would define identity in light of Leibniz's law, minimally speaking, he's occupying different space. That alone would negate any identity relationship. Maybe it would be a clone of me or some imitation of me, but it wouldn't be me. And if we talk about persons or different persons, I think we're also equivocating on the term person because if I say that, okay, you're a different person than me, that's not the same as saying, oh, we could just use another example. Our mutual Andrew, he did give up the faith and then he got it back. And so the Andrew without faith versus the Andrew with faith, um, that's different, but that's not the same kind of difference as the difference between Andrew and you.
Yeah, I understand that in one sense. Uh on the other sense, so let's absolve like the Leibnizian space problem, for example. Let's suppose that like I don't know, by some weird beetle in a box thought experiment twist of fate, right? If we can imagine a human mind being in the body of a beetle, we can imagine a human mind occupying the same mind, the same body as another mind. So let's imagine Andrew's past mind, in which he wasn't a Christian. He goes to sleep or something, and then he wakes up in his future body, already having converted back to Christianity. And so now we have these two things occupying the same space and so on. So we can like, you know, uh, kind of put aside the Leibnizian issues and just think about like now you have this like young non-believer Andrew mind in the mind of like believer older Andrew mind. And I don't think they're going to be very synchronous. I think they're going to have a lot to say to each other. And so in the sense that we talk about like the mind version of a person, um, I think let's focus kind of like there.
Right. So wait, are you saying that there's two minds occupying the same body? Was that your thought experiment?
Yeah, hypothetically.
Okay. Um. Right. That's interesting. So if past Andrew mind, Well, this is where a lot of these paradoxes become interesting, right? Because for example, we can think of the grandfather paradox, where if you go back in time and kill your grandfather, a lot of people conclude from these paradoxes that they demonstrate the impossibility of the thought experiment because it leads to a contradiction. Um, and what I would want to say, or what I'm inclined to say, is that in an analogous fashion, that would be it would lead to contradictions, and therefore wouldn't be a thing that's possible. With the definition that possible things are things that don't lead to contradictions.
Oh, right. I mean, I'm not saying like this could happen. The point of this thought experiment merely is just to say like I'm just trying to draw contrast between like two different ways in which a person is over time. Just to like put them in sharp contrast, because one thing that's really interesting is, when you're in your same body over time, you don't notice changes because it's like the frog in boiling water, so to speak. You're always in your head, and so everything you experience about you is from the first person perspective. And I was talking to Rasmussen about this on Twitter, and I said, as a really extreme example of this, people who get high or drunk experience what they do from the first person perspective, even if they're doing things they never would have done. And so if you want to go really crazy with it, hypothetically, aliens could like mind probe you or something and use magnets or something to get you to do or act in certain ways that you'll experience from the same first person perspective, as if even though they're things like you necessarily like wouldn't have done. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use this idea of a first person perspective experiences like not being sufficient to like guarantee that um the person having the experience like is the same person in the driver's seat, because like I don't know, me controlled by an alien parasite doing things differently, I wouldn't consider be me. I'd consider that to be some kind of what's the word, determinism. Like I'm being determined to act in certain ways I wouldn't by a parasite, even though I'm having the first person experience of it. And so that's why I'm thinking about this, like if you take a past mind and put it in a future mind, not saying it could possibly be done, but just as like a what if scenario. um I'm not saying like what world falls out of that without contradiction, but what I am saying is like uh just thinking about the contrast there. What does that look like?
Right. I think another way, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're getting at is sort of like what we see in the movie District 9, where the guy is turning into the alien and the South African government kidnaps him, and then he has this first person perspective of not wanting to shoot his arm cannon at a captive alien, but because they've hacked into his neurobiology, they're sort of overriding his first person perspective and causing him to shoot to kill this other alien. Is that kind of coercive experience what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's kind of like the dissonance I'm trying to bring about, in terms of like you having a first person experience of something that like you wouldn't necessarily do or intend to do, or so on. And so the first person experiences I'm trying to use here are just like imagining like Andrew's past mind, and it seems kind of silly to pick on Andrew, of course, but I guess he is a unconvert to convert, so he's like perfect for the example. um so if you have like this past Andrew mind that's kind of put in the head of present Andrew, and just experiencing things that present Andrew is doing and thinking and saying and whatnot from the first person perspective, so we can ignore the Leibnizian problems and so on. Now, if those two people were the exact same people, so like if somebody took you and put another copy of you into your head right now, and just like kept putting copies, exact copies of you into your head without personality quirks or anything else, I would intuitively expect some kind of like synchronization or harmony, because if you just put like me back in my own head observing what I do, I won't be surprised by the things that I'm doing or saying, because well, I'm me, in the present, and you're just copying me from the present in my present head. So everything I do will make sense. But in this example, past non-believer Andrew would look at present believer Andrew going to church and doing church things and some of his opinions on social media and so on, and he would be aghast that he's having these first person experiences about his own body, where all these weird contrary things are being done that like he wouldn't have done before he went to sleep, say yesterday. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So what it sounds like you're saying is that one of the two wills would be the dominant driver, and then one will would be the secondary observer, and that secondary observer would still be having an FPP, but it wouldn't be meaningful in the sense where meaningful implies direct control over the body. It would be sort of a passenger in a car.
Exactly right.
Yeah, yeah, that would probably be the case in that experiment.
And so what I'm trying to highlight there is like the dissonance, right? So if I just took another copy of me and just kind of put me in my own head as an observer of what I'm doing, I don't think there'll be a whole lot of tension there. But if you took past Andrew and put him in present Andrew as an observer, I think there would be like a whole lot of tension there. Past Andrew will be beside himself, like looking at what he's doing in the present and going, "Why are you doing that? God doesn't exist, blah, 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 blah. Why are you going to church? This is dumb. Why do you have these crazy conservative opinions or whatever? This is dumb." And so, like, the Andrew having a first person experience of his present form without knowing what's going on, uh would be in like utter shock that like he's so different than the way he was yesterday when he was having the first person experiences in his own body, in a way that, say, if present Andrew was just copied and put in present Andrew's head, uh I think that you'd have good synchronization.
Right. So what you're really getting at, Logos, is which Andrew has achieved the objective link over Andrew's body.
Not quite. I'm assuming for this thought experiment that present Andrew has the objective link, and past Andrew is just an observer. Uh, all I'm taking into account here is past Andrew's reactions to his observing his present behavior in the first perspective. That's what the interesting thing is. The fact that he would have such like a dissonance about his behavior in the present is what leads me to think that he's in some non-trivial sense really different compared to if present Andrew was just copied and put back into his own head as an observer. It's the dissonance in reaction that I'm highlighting.
Right. Well, couldn't we assume that it would be the case that since it's still Andrew's mind we're talking about, that over time a new synchronicity would form either for now obviously there's a discontinuity now, but we could assume that there would be some continuity in the future in favor of one or the other, or maybe to use a Hegelian uh, synthesis, there'd be a new third identity down the road.
Yeah, if past Andrew could talk to present Andrew, um, there could be a third identity, because the thing about present us is they never have to have robust arguments with past us, because in some sense past us is dead and can't argue for the way it used to think. So if it could, there'd be a third one. So in this thought experiment, I'm not imagining that past Andrew can like talk to present Andrew and like push back and whatever. He can just have kind of like a first person subjective reaction to what's being done, in the same way that the person could like react to in horror as his arm is used in District 9 to do things it was used for. So I'm assuming he has no controller ability to speak. He just kind of like looks and reacts, and I'm wondering, would he be surprised by the stuff present Andrew is doing, or would he be like completely like mystified or horrified, or some other very strong emotion he just doesn't understand it? Yeah.
Right. So we hear this a lot with people who have left one faith for another or one worldview for another. They'll look at some other person or remember their past self, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I would have totally done that." Usually in some sort of condemnatory way. And I think that in the situation you're envisioning, um, the sort of like skeptic atheist Andrew. Okay, so he could look back to when he was a Christian as a young person and say, "Well, yeah, of course I was going to do that. I was ignorant. I was foolish. Whatever." That same attitude, I think, would be projected in the future sense. It's like, "Oh, of course Andrew's doing this." That's what he would have done had he not had this new atheist middle territory from his early childhood faith.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's definitely right. Um, so all I'm trying to do is just like philosophically like amplify and like really think about this idea exactly that you brought up, that we can often look at our past selves that adhere to different worldviews and stuff as like different people. So I remember some of the things that I used to believe, and like I want to believe that I have a coherent identity over time. But then I think about like trying to talk to me from like 10 years ago and how that argument would go. And I don't think that either version of me would even recognize the stuff that we're saying to each other. Even with past me, future me with the benefit of like knowledge of past hindsight about myself, I think I'd still be such a foreign person that it would be as if I were talking to a stranger. And so the idea of these thought experiments is to think about the ontology of the mind over time. Obviously, our atoms change, but like the mind as well, is just to bring that into focus.
Right. Now, again, this is a purely hypothetical thought experiment, and what you and I are going to say about this can never be tested. I think that if present Todd were to go back in time and talk to past on any given issue, I believe that we would have an underlying common language. Maybe that's because I didn't change faith at all, like say other people. Maybe that's it. I don't know. But what I do think is though the same arguments that convinced me in the present and they didn't convince me all at once. So admittedly, past Todd wouldn't be convinced necessarily at the first go. But I think I could talk to past Todd and get him to come to these same conclusions or very similar conclusions because I think the underlying assumption I'm making is that past Todd and present Todd are still using the same reasoning processes. And so we would still come to the same conclusions, just that past Todd didn't have the information that present Todd has now.
Yeah, I've thought about that as well. And so here's an interesting like other layer we can add. We're not meta enough, Todd. We have to add more layers to this. We have to get really crazy. Um, so here's something else I've thought of about this, right? So let's suppose that you have like a devout Christian that dies as like a young adult, let's say like 25, 26, 27, somewhere in the 20s. And you might think that like this Christian might be saved. Because he's a devout Christian, he kept God's commandments and so on. But here's where things get interesting, right? So God knows your heart. And so God knows things that might convince you and other things. So something interesting to think about is if somebody was a Christian and then like gets convinced out of it later in life, and they'll be judged by the reasoning they ended up following to be convinced later in life. And like, them's the breaks. Would this Christian that died early, but in their heart would have been convinced by certain kinds of reasoning, but died before that could happen, would that Christian be judged as if they could have been, led astray by the reasoning, or would they be kind of sheltered from it because they died early?
Right. Okay. So what I would say is that you're judged for what you do, not what you don't do. So if you go back in time, for the first example you gave earlier in the episode, where you had a guy that was a Christian and then became an atheist, but what if he died when he was 20? And, for the thought experiment, he really was a Christian. Well, then he would have been saved. The fact that the future him would have apostatized wouldn't have been held to his account. But vice versa, if you have a guy that was an atheist and then lived to become a Christian and then died, he would be a Christian. So you're not held to account for what you didn't do or would have done, but what you did do. Or in this case, belief, not what you would have believed or don't believe, but what you do believe.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's kind of like the obvious answer, but what makes the question interesting to me is this idea that like, if we go back and talk to ourselves, we could always reconvince ourselves of the positions because we know what convinces us. And so I wonder if, like, philosophically speaking, part of the thing that makes us us as a matter of identity is exactly those like keys of reason that would convince us of certain propositions or other. And so if God like knows us before we're born at the level of the soul, I wonder if God just like knows some of those like those keys of reason that would convince us of certain things. And it just seems interesting, like how God would take that into account, like if we died. So you said that, like, if somebody was an atheist and became a Christian and then died a Christian, well, then good, they're a Christian. What if there's an atheist that like would have become a Christian, and God knows that that person would have found an argument or a person that could have convinced them? Like that's like written to their heart in the same way that we could go back into the past and always convince ourselves. Um, but like they died before like that just physically happened, like something came of it. Now, I mean, obviously we can talk about what we talked about in the very, very first episodes, that like God will hold you accountable for like what you did know and like the amount of the mountain that you were able to climb. But on the other hand, we also mentioned that, like, post Jesus, God gets a little more strict. You're responsible for knowing more because you could have known more. But now there's this extra layer of complexity where it's like the guy could have known more, but let's say he was kind of raised in a culture of atheism, grew up atheist or something, could have been convinced. God knows he could have been convinced for the same reasons we could go back in time and convince ourselves, because there's like something about us that like has this property. Um, would God take that into account at all?
Well, something much like what you're saying is when Jesus is judging Capernaum, he says that if the miracles had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah that had been done in your city, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. So, presumably, and this is actually one of the passages where William Lane Craig derives his concept. Well, he supports his concept of middle knowledge, but it's the idea that, well, they didn't actually repent because it didn't actually happen. But the God seems to know that under a certain set of conditions, if he had done that, that would have been the kind of thing that would have caused them to repent. But then the question is, are they going to be judged for what they would have done in that context? I don't think so. I think they're going to be judged for what they actually did do in their own context.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, that's a satisfactory answer. It's just something that kind of weighs on my mind. And hopefully you can see why it weighs on my mind, right? This is like really interesting stuff to think about, to just think about, not for any ulterior motive or anything else, but just like, I mean, part of the thing that again spawned this recent thoughts about this was just a random tweet I saw from Josh Rasmussen, and we had a conversation about this before, and then I had some conversations on Twitter, and I'm just like, wow, this is like even more complicated than it was back then when I was talking to Todd about this. This is just like 10 times like weirder. So I don't know. Hopefully you got some appreciation for that.
No, yeah, no, this is good. We're very high up in the meta. We're sketching out the landscape of the meta. That's always very abstract and tenuous.
Cool. So I don't know. What kind of thoughts do you have about this?
Well, I mean, at this point, I think we've kind of covered all the material that we needed to, and I don't know about you, but I need some time to just digest what we've said.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, thanks, Logos. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.